And today our guest is Bradley Hope, who's the best-selling author and the co-founder of Project Brazen, a journalism company creating thrilling books, podcasts, and documentaries. He's also the co-author of the New York Times bestseller $1 Billion Whale, a book about one of the world's biggest ever financial scandals, named Best Book of 2018 by the Financial Times and Fortune. Bradley is a Pulitzer finalist and a Gerald Loeb Award winner. He is formerly an enterprise reporter at the Wall Street Journal for 7 years.
Bradley, you have been secretly recorded, physically surveilled, and warned by Google that a foreign government was trying to hack into your personal Gmail account. So, you decided to hire a surveillance expert to train you in evading surveillance.
That's what this experience was I wanted to share that knowledge with other people, that every day across London, there's teams of 12, 15 people following someone around. And it could be a journalist, it could be a human rights activist, it could be a dissident.
Now I spend most of my career on narrative nonfiction over longer form, whether it's a book or a magazine article. So also it's having the opportunity to tell the story over that length in a way that is engaging for the audience. So it needs to have a really exciting world to explore as a result of it. You know, like right now I'm working on something that involves a, very rich guy in a yacht. And I think in a way it's like understanding the world of yachts, how yachts are made. And then that person, what led to them becoming who they are, similar to how your podcast structures things.
Exactly. I was just thinking about it. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm looking for those things that make it feel like something special, worth telling. I would say one thing that's important for journalism is that research is actually useful and incredibly important, but it's actually not the most important part. The most important part is...
Hi guys, pleasure to introduce you today to the Future of Skills podcast, no other than someone who has made it worthwhile when it comes to the ethical storytelling, Bradley Hope. He's also the author of the New York Times bestseller, The $1 Billion Whale, which I've got in front of me here. An amazing book that I've just been reading and we'll actually look into it a little bit more. And this is also a book of one of the world's biggest ever financial scandals, named Best Book of 2018 by the Financial Times and the Fortune. He's also the author of Blood and Oil, also Last Days of the Pharaoh, a chronicle on the final days and hours of the presidency of Hosni Mubarak. Today, we'll explore one of the most pressing conversations when it comes to building the future. And what I mean by that, the topic of today is the skill of truth, what it takes to be an investigative journalist in a changing world. Bradley, thank you for making the time to be here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And given the fact that every single episode we're starting here is coming up with a tradition already, we're very keen on finding out how the interviewee see themselves, how our guests portrays themselves in 3 words of their choice, please. So if you don't mind letting us know how you see yourself.
I think, so 3 different words in a row, but not like a sentence.
No.
I think I would say investigative, maybe, inventor, and enterprising. I don't know, something like that.
Excellent, excellent. We'll definitely tap a little bit more into each of these words because I can see the core of this is the investigation part of what you've been doing. And this paves nicely way into the next question that we will uncover in our discussion today. And that is, what has drew your attention to the investigative journalist in the first place? We'll then look into your childhood and whatnot.
I would say, when I was younger, I was very interested in different things. I didn't know that I wanted to be a journalist when I was like in high school necessarily, but I knew I loved to write and I loved English, like literature.
Yeah.
But also I was a very involved person, so I was very active. I wasn't sort of like a library kind of person. And so I didn't quite know how they all fit. And I experimented with journalism at school, but for some reason at the very end of my high school, I decided that I was pretty sure that that's what I wanted to do.
Yep.
And I even wrote an email to the editor of this university newspaper before I arrived saying, I'm going to come,
Yeah.
And so I think I knew pretty early, like 18, that this was what I wanted to do. And it was never about investigative journalism. It was just pure journalism. So for me, investigative journalism is a word that isn't my favorite word in general because it sounds like you're just doing this one particular thing, but all of journalism is what I'm interested in. Even today, sometimes I write cultural commentary for the Wall Street Journal or other places, or I write feature stories. And at the Wall Street Journal, I used to love to write these comedic stories, which were not comedic. They were kind of like slice of life, like the strange little interesting things about the world. Every day on the front page, they have one of those articles. So I loved writing those as well. So I think what I love about being a journalist is having this permission to be curious all the time, to ask questions all the time, and to, in a way, see the changes in the world and be the first one to see those changes. So, when you're early in journalism and you see that a new building is coming up, you have this instinct to say, okay, there's a new building. Who's building it? What's going on here? Is there an issue? Is this affecting the neighborhood or whatever? And the average person, when they see that building, they just say, oh, there's a building. But a journalist feels like empowered, in a sense, to understand what's going on here.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. It does help understand a little bit more about how you see yourself as part of the world, and in terms of that you're not indifferent, right? You're trying to figure out, okay, how do things work? How to put them together? How does this puzzle come together? But in terms of the underneath, in terms of you coming up with these questions, what drives you? What's your core belief? What keeps you up at night?
I think I'm myself a difficult customer. So I know that if I'm going to read something or engage with it, it has to really connect for me. So it has to get my attention. So I think one thing that drives me is to really serve the audience well, so that they feel like, wow, this is a story I'd never heard of, or I want to read this story and I want to read it to the very end. A lot of times in newspapers, people skim the first beginning and they stop reading. And for me, I'm always looking to write a story in a way that they want to follow it to the very end. And so, that kind of thing keeps me up. I have an eternal anxiety that I won't find my next big story, but I never have that problem. But I do live in fear sometimes, where I'm like, well, what if I can't find another story as good as the last story? That's a very classic journalistic problem, though, because, the day you do your big story in the newspaper, you're already feeling anxious about what's my next story going to be. But I think in general, one thing that drives me is a very strong sense of wonder and curiosity. And even in investigative circumstances, I'm not really driven by some sort of high and mighty self-identity that I'm doing public good or anything like that. I think of it much more craftsman-like, which is I like to tell stories and I like to find things out. And I especially like to find things out that are hard to find out. And so it's almost like the puzzle itself, the mystery of it. And the end product is just information, but I enjoy that process.
And that's key, isn't it? The process and the navigation of it that allows you to perfect your skills, meanwhile, to perfect your habits, perhaps. You have nicely shared here the point around putting the story together, and the fact that you're investigative in your nature, which allows you to go into a little bit more in depth and probably deeper than somebody else would have done it before you. But for a story to actually capture your attention, what are some of the key elements that you're seeking in a story to actually do that?
I think one thing that is very important to me is that there's a surprising element.
Yes.
So, for example, if there's a story about a mafia thing and, one mafia guy kills another mafia guy, there's something about that just feels predictable. Yeah, that I would assume that they would do that, things like that. But if you told me that one of the mafia guys had a hobby, that he was a amazing watchmaker, and that he was on one hand a mafia guy, but on the other hand, he was a watchmaker. And there was this connection between these two identities. Then I might get more interested, and that's something I just made up. But I think in general, I'm always looking for the surprising element. And surprises can be found on any story. You have to look for them in the right place. So it might not be in the plot of the story, so to speak, or the events of what happened, but it could be in the character, or it could be in, even the language of the person. So I'm really looking for that novel element, because there's a million stories a day happening, and they need to have something novel and intriguing or surprising. And then also, of course, because now I spend most of my career on narrative nonfiction over longer form, whether it's a book or a magazine article. So also it's having the opportunity to tell the story over that length in a way that is engaging for the audience. So it needs to have a really exciting world to explore as a result of it. Like right now I'm working on something that involves a, very rich guy in a yacht. And I think in a way it's like understanding the world of yachts, how yachts are made. And then that person, what led to them becoming who they are, similar to how your podcast structures things.
Exactly. I was just thinking about it. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think, I'm looking for those things that make it feel like it's something special, worth telling, because not every story is worth telling at that length.
Agreed. Yeah. And back to the craftsmanship in terms of how you put your story together, how you collect all of those pieces of the puzzle to make it worth then telling ultimately. What do you feel is most important for you when getting yourself immersed in the process? Is it meeting the people? Is it finding out some intricacies around some of the details that you were just saying? Okay, if it's a mafia guy, then being a watchmaker kind of makes sense because he's very attentive to details. Is it any particular part of the process that attracts you most?
I would say one thing that's important for journalism is that research is actually useful and incredibly important, but it's actually not the most important part. The most important part is to meet people, because the information that you are looking for doesn't already exist. If it already exists, you're just kind of recovering old ground. So what you want to do is find a person who is a first-hand witness, or they knew the person or whatever, and you want to talk to them in a way that isn't necessarily overly structured, but is, as you're listening to them, the most important skill in journalism that is hard to gain unless you've been put through a lot of pressure is, as you're interviewing someone, you're already writing it at the same time. So as they're talking, you're putting a circle around something they just said and thinking, okay, I like that. That opens up, mid part of the story. That would be a great moment, and you're thinking about scenes. So as they start saying something, and young journalists, they have this problem all the time. Someone will start saying something amazing and interesting, but they'll have like a list of questions and they'll be moving on to the next question. But actually what they just said is worth spending the whole interview on just that one thing.
Totally agree.
And so that only comes from the pressure of deadline writing. And deadline writing in a newspaper means getting assigned something in the morning and having to finish it by the end of the day. And then later on, even in books and things like that, is the pressure of actually having to write a book. One of the problems with writing a book is it's easy to kind of say, oh, I'm going to write a book, and this is what chapter 1 is going to be in 2. That's relatively easy. When you actually start writing a chapter and you have to find, call it 5,000 words or maybe even more, if depending on how you structure it, that's when you really realize, oh, wow, I'm in trouble, because a single 1,000 words takes a lot of different information from different places, and it goes into that 1,000 words. So as you start to realize, oh wait, my book's going to be 100,000 words, or that would be a classic nonfiction book, then you realize that the reporting, and the original reporting especially, is so important.
You've mentioned an interesting point here about meeting people, and the fact that when listening to them, you have to have a very good ear in order to capture some of the elements of what they say that could actually be more important than your entire list of questions you prepared up front for them. And that's cool, I see, because my dad, for instance, he is a crime investigator. He's been doing this for years, and he told me once when I was little that he said, to get the person to speak, it's an art. What do you think about that?
Oh yeah, I absolutely believe it's an art, and it's an art in which there are many different tactics as well. So one thing you learn in a newspaper, because usually it's open, so you hear everyone on the phone all the time, is you can see that people have radically different ways of accomplishing the same goal. Yeah. So some people are very aggressive, and they put pressure on people to give them information. And then some people are extremely nice and so solicitous and kind in all their interactions, and they also get good results. So I think one of the things, again, it's only through practice. And then some people, they just have an innate skill set for it. But I would say that every interaction requires its own strategy to get the information you want. And journalism is a pretty brutal industry in a sense, because you really have only one master, and that's the audience. Yeah. And so to serve them well, you have to get the information from the person, and the person themselves is not your priority, So I would say I find for myself that, and I wouldn't say I've got the perfect model, but that I'm constantly understanding the core psychological tendencies of the person I'm talking to. So just to give an example, in the beginning of my career, I was a police journalist. So I covered crime in New York City.
Yeah.
And I was based inside police headquarters, which was a unique New York City thing. And an older journalist from a tabloid was telling me, I said, how do you get sources? And he was explaining to me that, some police officers feel aggrieved, like their boss shouldn't be, in the position they are, but and they are jealous in a sense. Yeah. And he said that's a great motivation. You get them to talk about the boss in the way that they don't like. And then some people, obviously, there's more of a mythical thing of a whistleblower who just wants to do the public good. Those are pretty rare, I find. I'm not even sure that exists in the way that people think. But everyone has a motivation and have a reason to want to talk. And so that's why, former employees are good sources on a current company, because they left and they feel aggrieved. So yeah, every conversation, you have to also kind of play it by ear. There's been many situations where you could say something wrong and you can see the change. So for example, if you say something that reflects a version of the person in front of you that they don't agree with, like let's say that they don't think that they're a victim of something, but you thought they were. And then now they think that you think they're a victim. That can be a problem. So you have to adjust and notice what happened, because you can recover from that, but only if you notice what's going on. But anyways, journalism is a bit more of a pressured environment.
Yeah.
Similar to police. I think probably in everyday business, you don't want to overuse the same tactics.
How deep, as per the approach, it might be, isn't it? In terms of, as you said yourself, trying to find the motivations of a given person and then tap into that, but without making him aware that that's your perhaps strategy up front, just making sure that you've got this alignment with the person first. And that's what my dad was telling me, that you have to understand that the person needs to know that in a way you trust them for what they need to bring up to the table, and then that bonding comes across first. So the focus on the bonding should be there as opposed to the focus on the end information, because if that's something that they understand, then it's not going to happen. You lose trust. Yeah,
actually there was I forget the name now, which I can share with you later, but there was a Nazi interrogator during World War II. And he was such a legendarily successful interrogator that after World War II, he was brought to America.
How interesting.
And given citizenship and helped to understand, why are you so good at this? And essentially, he was never mean to anyone. He was never difficult with anyone. And everything that we now see on the movies and stuff where they, give them a coffee and they try to be kind to them and they try to build a rapport, that was sort of originated from this one guy, And so I often think about that kind of character, because there are some people who are just so good at it. And it's not because they read a book or they designed it. I mean, good journalists usually don't come from, you would think if you went to the best schools and have the best degrees, those tend to not be the best journalists. The best journalists are people that know people. They understand people. And where you get really special journalists is someone who can do that, but they also can write. And that's the hard thing to find, because most journalists are either good at reporting or good at writing, but not necessarily good at both. And that's one of the big challenges. But in general, I think a former bartender is a much better journalist than a Harvard PhD,
You're luring me into changing a career. It's so interesting, this element of being a journalist, an investigative journalist. And that actually comes with another question I might have for you, Bradley. Can you please let me know, in terms of your childhood, I'd be very curious to find out what has formed you, in terms of, were there any particular mentors, were there any particular key moments that you felt, that's the kind of thing that I need to keep track of more so?
Yeah, I can think of a few. So, well, first of all, my father was in the military, so we moved around a lot when I was a kid. And then he also had a kind of career where he changed locations a lot after the military, so when he was working in business. So as a child, we moved around many, many times. So we never stayed in one place for even sometimes 1 year, and we moved to the next place. And then at one point, we moved to Europe. My dad was working for Coca-Cola at the time. So we lived in Vienna, Bucharest, and then Budapest. And all of that moving and that quite international experience was very important to me because even though I'm very clearly American, I developed this very third-person perspective on the world because if I had grown up only in America, the places that we had been living, I would have struggled to adapt that kind of really outside myself perspective that happens by being a kind of perpetual expat.
Yeah.
So I think that was very important for me, living abroad a lot and moving around a lot. And then I would say when I was in high school or secondary school, I had a teacher who knew I liked to write. He was an English teacher called Simon Wright. And I remember there was this moment where he saw I liked to write. He saw I was interested in journalism, and he gave me a book, which is called The Great Shark Hunt by this journalist called Hunter S. Thompson, who's famous because he was kind of a big drug taker. But in reality, he was also a great journalist before he was known for that other stuff. And so he gave me this book, and it was kind of like slightly inappropriate in a sense because this was like out of the curriculum. And he said, and he also said to me, just keep writing. That was his advice. It was pretty straightforward. He even read some things I wrote that weren't very good, and he marked them up. And this was just off of the school curriculum. So that was something that I found very inspiring. And then early in my career, I had a few different mentors. I had someone who's a friend of mine still to this day. He's called Steve Fishman. He was a legendary magazine writer, and I helped him almost like an intern on one of his stories. And then we stayed in touch all these years later. And then I also had a really important relationship, which was, so the most famous, one of the most famous American journalists of all time is a guy called 𝐤𝐸. And he is in his 90s now. And when I first was reading him, I was like in my early 20s, and I was reading other writers' work, especially earlier in their career, not their late career stuff where they're famous, but early in their career, and just trying to understand what was different about this person. And so I started reading some of 𝐤𝐸's old stories about New York City, which were amazing. And I found this one particular article, which was just a little colorful story about a kid that was fishing coins out of a grate, and he had invented this kind of like fish hook thing to get coins out. And he was clearly not a very rich kid, but 𝐤𝐸 wrote a story and focused on this guy. And so I used some tools to find that guy, at that time, so 50 years later or something. So I decided to write a letter to 𝐤𝐸 to tell him, you should do a follow-up story.
That's amazing. I love that.
Yeah, and then 𝐤𝐸 wrote me back, and he invited me to dinner, and because he lived in New York City. And for next couple of years, I was kind of like a hanger-on. And so I got to meet all these crazy characters who, a lot of them quite a bit older than me. But I learned a lot from that, from him, from just even being invited into his world, which was completely different than what I was able to access. And even today, I still stay in touch with him. And I saw him a couple of years ago when I was in New York.
How deeply inspirational that is, isn't it? You've shown him that not only did you care about the story that he wrote a long time ago, but you've delved into some of the nitty-gritty of the personal skills of that, the kid at the time, and you've then followed up the story later on, which I'm sure anyone would appreciate, and someone with his view of the world and understanding the characters, that probably was quite a gift you've given him too.
Yeah, I actually agree with you very much, though, because I think a lot of people might say, oh, I'm going to write a letter to this person, and I'm going to say, hi, this is about me. I wanted to tell you about me.
That's easy to do,
I would love to, talk to you about my career or something. But that's not something very interesting for someone like that to receive. That shows, in a sense, almost like a kind of selfishness.
Yes.
And also sometimes your mentors are not going to be even self-identifying as a mentor. So, for example, another experience I had, which was I had this very strong drive to go to the Middle East when I was a young journalist. And so I started taking Arabic lessons, and I was trying to really prepare myself for that. And I went to this one talk by this very famous journalist called Lawrence Wright. And at the end of the talk, I said to myself, you know what, I got to go talk to this guy. So I waited in the line, and I was the last person in the line. And I just asked him one small question. I said, I said, I love what you do, and I want to do something like that. And, what do you think I should do? Where should I go? And he just said, go to Cairo. Yeah, I think you'll like it there. There's a lot of great characters. It's a good place to start. But he said it to me in a very confident way, almost like colleagues. Yeah. Not like talking down to me. And very nice. I said, love that. You know what? That's very practical advice. And then I did everything I could to get to Cairo, and eventually I did. And then I wrote him a message. I'm like, I'm in Cairo, and I met him in Cairo. He came to Cairo at one point. So now he doesn't think of himself as my mentor, and maybe in a sense I don't either. But that was a very important mentor kind of comment,
And as you said yourself, practical advice, something you can actually took on board and action upon it. That's amazing. In fact, talking about the discoveries of the traits, the skills you mentioned, you took an interest into that boy who clearly was quite ingenious in the way that he approached things. What do you think were some of the key traits that you have picked up along the way in your career that you were thinking, okay, probably it is something essential for someone like me doing what I do?
I think, one of the most fundamental things is knowing that you don't know very much, and never thinking you know a lot. So even when people sometimes they want me to talk about money laundering or something, and I'll say, yeah, I'm happy to tell you about the stories that I've come across and what they might reflect, but I don't believe that I'm an expert on money laundering, and any journalist who thinks they know something is in trouble, because there's just no journalist who really truly knows something more than someone else. What they do know is what they don't know and how to find out. So a book isn't a reflection of what's inside my mind of like what I thought of and I wrote it out like a great scientist or a great philosopher or something. Yeah. It's because I'm out talking to people and I'm collecting what they know about this situation and I'm putting it all together. And so it's very important for journalists not to think that they know anything, to be honest. So I think that's one thing. Another thing is, also, I would say to accomplish a big task or a big goal, you have to set the goal and then you have to push yourself to achieve it. You can't set a goal that's based on what you are currently able to do. So like a book's a good example. Sometimes you'll, for me, I've proposed books that I didn't know how I was going to pull it off yet. I just had confidence that I could follow a process and be creative, and if this doesn't work, then I'll try this and keep doing that until at the end there's a book. And so, but if I had said, oh, I'm only going to propose a book based on what I already know, I wouldn't propose any books because I don't know anything, So I think in a sense, I'm always thinking and telling people that you should propose something that's more ambitious than you think you can currently achieve, and not outrageously so, but something that pushes you. And then that's how you'll get to do it. You won't be able to do it just based on what you currently have,
I love that you're giving me confidence to participate in a project which is quite ambitious, to be fair, highly ambitious. But then to your point, you kind of need to push yourself forward. You will never know if you're able to do it unless you try.
Yeah, and most of the time when you push yourself to achieve something and give yourself permission to do something like that, you accomplish something no matter what. Even if you fail, like I would say I failed many times. I failed, especially in starting a business, but I strangely don't feel guilty about any of those failures. I only think of it as, okay, well, either it worked and it yielded a result, or it didn't work and it yielded information, Yep. and it yielded experience. And so sometimes it's expensive experience, but I think that's another thing I think about a lot. And then also just, I think for me in particular, one thing I'm always afraid of is assumptions too, because sometimes you can even assume one single thing and it can affect the entire story that you write. And then later on you realize, oh, that assumption was wrong and I have to go back, So there's a lot of things like that I think about.
Thank you so much for bringing up the topic of failures. If that's okay, I'd love to ask a few questions around that. Were there any particular very precious failures that you might say, yes, I'm glad that I failed there?
Well, I would say in a more abstract way, I would say it's business interactions. Right. So it's like, for example, having a great relationship with a potential business partner and a deal is emerging and it feels good and it feels great. And then assuming that it will then continue to actually happen, because that happens a lot in business, is that there's a lot of good energy and good vibes and everyone's excited, but it's actually maybe they're concealing something on their side, inability to close the deal, or they don't actually have the resources to carry out the deal or whatever it might be. And so I'm glad that I experienced that, because if I had experienced only things that worked out accordingly to the plan, yep, then I would be vulnerable to those things happening to me in the future. So now I consider myself more protected against things, because I know realistically a good feeling or even a handshake or even a contract doesn't mean that it's going to work. It could completely fall apart at any time up until when it's done. It has to be done, you know? So I think that's kind of what I'm thinking about more. And then in journalism, I don't really think of anything I've done as a failure. I think of it as incomplete. So for example, if I pursued a story and I didn't succeed, I still have it in my mind as something that maybe I still can pull it off, you know, and I have probably longer stamina for a mystery than most people. So if something was a mystery for me 5 years ago, I'm still thinking about it every week, and then I'm looking for that little way in that maybe I can solve it, you know.
How interesting. It sounds that being the type of person who pursues something of very high interest, but for whatever reason might have not uncovered it straight then when you were expecting it to happen. Some things basically just didn't join up for whatever reason, but you're still with your thinking on it. Would there be any particular story that you might want to share as of being incomplete in that sense?
Well, there was one story I did in the Wall Street Journal which kind of exhibited this. So I won't get into too much technical detail, but basically somebody gave me a document about a person and they said, this person might be a crook. Here's a document. So I wrote a story afterwards that basically said somebody is out there to like impugn this person and take him down. And that person was actually quite angry with me. He said, why did you write an article that kind of repeated what people are saying about me, but I told you it's not true and that there's someone out to get to me. And so the story was accurate. It was said there's a campaign against this person, and he just didn't like the details were recirculated. But he in that time that he called me and said, you know, I'm not happy that you wrote that story. I said to him in that moment, I'm like, listen, I'm going to find out who did this to you, and I really am gonna do it. And he didn't really believe me probably, but again, it was something that was on my mind for years, and eventually I did the story. And I called him up and I'm like, look, I told you I was going to figure it out in the end, you know? So it was a story that maybe most people would have said, that's just too hard to solve. Like the mystery is too difficult to unpack. And how are you going to get enough proof to put it in the newspaper? But I just was very patient, you know? And I was really aggressive on that story too. I remember one time on that story, there was one person I wanted to talk to. He was ignoring me. And so I waited outside of his office and he came out by luck and got into a taxi, and I got in with him without his permission. So in the end, we actually became, friendly. But at that moment, you know, I just said, listen, I got to talk to you. I've been looking for you for a long time, you know? So anyways, I think that's how I think about it.
You're reminding me of a story. Probably you might have seen this movie on Netflix as well. It's something to do with Spotify and how they have pitched for their businesses long before to bigger media corporations. And there was this similar element when he was trying to get hold of a person that he really needed their support, and you know they were oblivious, didn't want to necessarily interact at the time. But it's the how he made it that really stuck up with me.
Yeah, and that's I think it's a very important lesson for everyone, is that things are not going to go, if you're trying to do anything ambitious or anything interesting, there's going to be so many roadblocks and so many things that are going to try to stop you. And even your own inertia is going to pull you down and not make you do the thing. So big things are only accomplished really through pushing through that to some extent.
And thinking outside of the box as well, isn't it? Just trying to, as you said, some people might think that it's too complex. That's why they wouldn't want to unpack the story. But you still try to persevere, and probably that might win you later some valuable nuggets along the way. So in terms of, you mentioned some of the verification techniques, you mentioned thinking a little bit outside of the box, but talking about the emerging journalist, someone who's just starting out in their career, and given the fact that we're living in an age of automation, deepfakes, and overwhelming information, would there be any particular advice that you might want to come up with and say, guys, you actually need to be aware of X and your skill set would need to focus on Y?
I think, well, I would say, interestingly, I would say to them that they need to do two very opposite things at the same time. On one hand, they need to be very good at the human interaction, because automation is going to struggle so AI is going to struggle to generate new information about the world.
Agreed.
So it can summarize things. It can do even amazing things. I'm a big believer in AI. I really love to interact with it, but I would never use it to generate what's next, because that inference skill is pretty weak compared to a human's. And no matter what's going to happen, AI is not going to be interviewing people anytime soon and then writing articles based on those interviews. And it's definitely possible. It's technically possible. Someone's going to try it, but it's not as big of a risk as for other careers. So I think if I was talking to a young journalist, I would say go and make sure that you're always meeting people all the time. My first job was a very old-fashioned newspaper. They didn't allow tape recorders. And they said, because they didn't want you to be slowed down. They want you to be faster. If you're listening to a tape and transcribing, it takes extra time.
Yeah,
and they had a rule as well that you had to be taking people to breakfast as often as possible. It's a very New York City thing. So you'd be having these 8 a.m. meetings with people, and it was extremely smart idea, because if you take people to breakfast frequently, and if you're in trouble for not doing it, you'll force yourself to meet people. And in those meetings, you're talking to them about whatever. Like when I was in crime, I talked to somebody and they would be giving you ideas for your next story. And then you'd be done and you go straight to work, and you'd be sitting there with an idea, So I think that a lot of young journalists love to sit at computers and investigate that way, which is really, you can find amazing things. But
it's the first source, isn't it? The actual person who knows it.
And also in person makes such a difference as well. It's just every time you do it, you just remember, why don't I do this more? This is so much better. You just gain so much more. You gain so much more, even cooperation from the person, and like it becomes a longer term relationship. So on one hand, I think that's really important, the human skills.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, they should master the technological skills too. Because when you can marry those two things together, you're a very powerful person. And by being able to confidently generate the idea and get the information and do the interviews, and then at the same time work with these increasingly powerful tools, that combination makes you a very hireable or important sort of journalistic character. I think it will be not too long from now when a lot of the technical skills around production and, anything
editing
will be just taken away. It'll just be taken away.
Yeah.
So it's all about being the originator of stories and then knowing how to use these tools to, I would say, execute them to an even better quality. So like filling in the research. And also one thing I love personally about using AI is to question my own ideas. So if I say, this is an idea I have, can you reason for and against this idea? Especially there's certain models like in ChatGPT O3.
I think I've tried that too.
Yeah, so O3 will really, I find that process incredibly useful because it constantly helps you find things that you don't know. A problem with something that you thought was a good idea.
Yeah.
And just getting that feedback. And so I think also it's me, no journalist nowadays should turn in an article that is not really good, or it also can't look like it's written by AI. But AI should be guiding them like an editor, You should say to the AI, I'm writing this story, this is what I'm thinking, and you go back and forth and you figure out the right structure, you write it, and then you go back and forth again about refining it and making sure that it sounds really good and it sounds like it was written by you, but it's also not sloppy. And like I told you earlier, there's many journalists who are good reporters but not good writers, and they should be aided by this, this process.
That's a great instinct you've just shared, because my next question was around the writing skills in terms of how do you perfect them now, given the fact that, yes, AI is there. It can definitely help you probe some questions, probe some hypotheses. But then how do you then try and do something else around probably reading some of the actual books, or what else can you do?
Well, the biggest risk with AI is that it can produce pretty good content, pretty good writing, but it's extremely flat. And I was having this discussion yesterday with a really good friend of mine about something that we had looked at that was generated by AI. It had all the information was there, but it had this two-dimensional quality. Like it lacked narrative, it lacked character,
stickiness.
the little quirks of storytelling that make it work. It was very uniform, and this was a very well done example. So the risk is, if you are, let's say you're a journalist or a writer, is that if you are relying on that too early, and if you don't know what's good and what's not good, then you're going to not be able to rise above, So it's still so important to read and to write and to not just use it to write everything. But once you feel like you've kind of got a strong position, then it's a great tool, you know. But if you kind of were born in the AI era and you never had to write anything, that's the risk of not being able to write something that's distinct, you know.
Thank you so much for sharing this, because my next question would have been around the goals of the project that you've set up at Project Brazen. If you can let me know, given the fact that, you are interested in writing books, you're an award-winning author, you've got a great team of investigative journalists here who are producing podcasts or helping me as well to produce my podcast, and I'm deeply grateful for that. Meanwhile, what is the vision? What is the mission of the brand as well?
I would say that we were feeling like we didn't want to be constrained anymore by the boundaries of an institution that already exists. So while I love the Wall Street Journal and I still write for the Wall Street Journal, I wanted to be in a place where I could decide what I was going to do with my time, not just write articles that fit into these different boxes on the newspaper, which I still like to do from time to time. But I wanted to be able to push myself. I didn't want to spend my career as a journalist who worked in a newspaper who then retired from that newspaper and just wrote books. I wanted to do everything. So, right now we are just doing our first big documentary film with a partner. And, we're experimenting all the time and thinking about the audience in a much more radical way, not just giving them things in the traditional ways they received it. And even in podcasts, bringing a much more almost like print narrative perspective on podcasts. And just so I think in general, we wanted to just have that freedom, and even things like AI or whatever it might be, we have more freedom to experiment because we're not constrained the way that a big institution is. And so for me, the number one thing was just having the freedom and the pressure to come up with new things, new styles of things. And even as a result of all the things we've done, we're now getting more involved in technology as well. Like we're building some technology that we think is useful, And so that to me is very exciting, to have that freedom to do things like that.
Thank you so much. It shows the fact that it comes from the prerogative or you're thinking that you want to be useful with the services that you provide, for sure. But in terms of what's out there that really excites you in return, be it a story or a particular, angle of a story, or would you want it to be more of a hub, or are you open to many verticals to be covered as part of Project Brazen? How do you approach things?
Yeah, I think for the time being, we're probably more of a particular originator of stories. We don't have a lot of collaborators right now, though we'd be open to it. It's more that the way that this industry works is we don't have the resources necessarily to sponsor everyone else's work, whereas we know how to do it ourselves. So we do a lot in-house at this point.
Yep.
I think that's kind of our model for now. And what we want to do, though, is we want to be producing things every year that are different than the year before. So we did a lot of podcasts. Right now, we're doing a lot more long-form written work. And we want to just constantly be pushing ourselves to think about how to do things differently, do things better, and in collaborating with people. But I think at this point, Brazen itself has a very strong kind of aesthetic and style and perspective, and we're sort of cultivating that right now. That's what we're focused on.
And that's key, isn't it, as a term, to cultivate. Do you feel that as part of this process of cultivating certain, important elements of what would then shape your future and the project itself, do you think talent discovery is something you might be interested in? Or, because I know you've already just hired a lady I've seen on LinkedIn who's actually Ukrainian, and because I'm part Ukrainian, obviously, I found synergy. How do you have your eye laser focused on that part?
Yeah, I mean, so far, a lot of our experiences. So we a lot of our original podcasts were partly us reaching out to someone else that we wanted to partner with. I think it's something that I want to increase my abilities on, is how do you find the next great person rather than the existing great person? It's something that I believe in personally. I haven't figured it out yet, but I think I'm going to be better at it than I was when I first started, I think talent discovery is very important, though. It's also where you get that those things I'm looking for in stories, originality, something surprising. It comes from finding a person who just has a really interesting way of doing things or looking at the world, or they have an ability to be an inventor in a sense, which is some word I used earlier on, which is, so journalism, people often think that it's about collecting what's happened already, but it's also very much about anticipating as well. So
I like that.
I think you have to anticipate based on how things are going, where is the collision going to be, and being ready for that and preparing for that moment to be ready for the moment when that collision is going to happen. So it might be, for example, seeing what's going on in AI right now and saying, I have a strong hypothesis that this is going to be the conflict that's going to erupt from this. So now I'm going to go out and look for signs that that's already happening, little edge signs.
Gotcha.
And so the best journalist is not just collecting existing facts, but they're anticipating. And I think that's true for a business person too, is they're not just filling an immediate market need, they're imagining what the market need might evolve into, and what the products people might need are in the future, or envisioning a new world where that's what the world looks like in the future. And so I think in a way, people sometimes think of journalists as like almost a very backward looking group, but I think of it as in this best form as sharing the same entrepreneurial energy as like a founder of a company.
You're now inspiring me to a thought here. We had the Oxford University professor not so long ago on the podcast, who's the head of AI at Oxford, and he was talking about some of the greatest science fiction authors in the history, such as Ray Kurzweil and obviously Isaac Asimov as well. I've recently also bought a book of Isaac Asimov on the Greek mythology, and it's inspiring just to understand what has been inspiring them when they were growing their craftsmanship at the time, and then to your point of trying to imagine a world, to see what are some of the initial signals that it might go that way, so that you can then portray something. And it turns out, particularly with Ray Kurzweil, that some of his predictions were so spot on that for some reason he was really far ahead of his time. He was only doing it in the 60s, when in fact he was describing something that is more or less happening now. So it's fascinating how things can turn up with that type of skills of just being a good observer, isn't it?
Yeah.
To look for clues and signals, which is paving nicely our way into the book, into the $1 Billion Whale. I'm just going to show it again just so it's a bit closer. But I'm very inspired about what you were sharing in terms of the actual story, but the key protagonist in the story being someone who has been the reason of making this whole biggest fraud in the whole of the global economic framework, which I'm going to read a little bit more from the book here because it comes with a few quotes. So in *Billion Dollar Whale, you described Joe Low, am I pronouncing it correctly, Joe Low? As the alleged mastermind of one of the largest financial frauds in modern history. A serial fabulist, I love this how he put it, because it immediately describes the person in his traits who figured out how the world really works, and that's also key. You also write that his success was rooted in the failures of the 21st century global economy. Now, another good point, because he's been a deal breaker in that sense. He's really broken through the system. So based on your laser-sharp research, what do you believe shaped his system hacking mindset? And what belief system or internal logic might have fueled his actions? Because it's been quite astonishing to notice that something like that is possible.
Yeah, I think though with people, with sort of massive fraudsters and characters like that, or any kind of criminal, there's obviously something different about them. So he's not just an ordinary person who made bad decisions or something. I think he had a perspective that you can follow all the way back to his childhood, that he was looking for some sense of agency in the world and some sense of identity, and he was struggling with even just the way he looks and even maybe the limits of his own intelligence. And so he, rather than just improving those things, I suppose, you can't really change how you look, but to some extent you can. Instead of improving those things, he invented more and more elaborate fictions that made him look better in front of other people. And that's really what it all comes down to for him. He wanted to look good in front of other people. He wanted to look good in front of his dad, who was a businessman who was relatively successful, his grandfather, and he wanted to look good in front of his mom. And then beyond that, he wanted to look good in front of women. That was something very interesting to him and very important to him. And then he wanted to look good in front, and then his ambitions just kept increasing. He wanted to look good in front of the prime minister, in front of the bankers, in front of the celebrities. And so everything he did was about making people, was figuring out his ultimate skill that he had was understanding exactly the thing that a person needed, and he would provide it to them. So if and he had this ability to see the truth about people that's very rare. It's a special skill. So for example, the average person doesn't understand this, but a billionaire still has needs. You know, the average person will think, well, they have everything. They have $1 billion, so they can spend it and they can buy whatever they need. But there's always something they can't get. And so for those people, it might be something like, it could be something as simple as access to a celebrity, which they can't buy their way. They don't know how to buy their way to that access. Or it could be something else like having a reputation for something else, you know, something beyond being rich. And so that was something that Joe understood instantly about every single person. So he would know them in the way that you would never want to be known, which is what really is your desire. You know, so if it's money or any of the vices, he would just know instantly, and he would kind of meet you with that thing that you want, and he would become the person that did that for you. And the other thing he had was a incredible ability to lie to people and remember the lie they told that person, but not, and then also remember the lie they told that other person, because every person has their own set of lies that from him. It's not the same set of lies, you know? And so being able to hold all that in his head at the same time, and then also not have those people talk to each other and compare notes and figure out what was a lie and what was not a lie. That is a skill that it's not necessarily a skill I'd want to have, but it's a skill that he had. And after everything blew up, they started talking to each other a little bit by bit, and they're realizing, wait, he told all of us a different story, you know? And some people initially thought that the Prime Minister of Malaysia was the head of this whole thing and he was the crook. But we know this for sure, that the only person at the top is Joe by himself. There's no one else next to him. And then there's only tiers below that of people that had some knowledge or knowledge of this, but not that. But the only person that held it all in his head was Joe.
How is this possible? That's my own key question I would have in my head, because how is this possible that he thought he might have this audacity to fool so many high profile people around the world, and then to also manipulate with billions in the mix, to make sure that he can get away with that, because he sort of is still getting away with that to this date.
Yeah, I think he understood a few things. One of them he understood was, one of the things that's important is that he had an exponential curve of tricking people. So when he was in school, he did something small, like almost like a stunt. And then as he got older, he kept doing bigger and bigger things. He convinced these people to give money, and then he paid that person with the money that person gave, so they felt like they got a profit, you know, like a pyramid scheme. So he did these things one by one, and then they kind of started to grow. And in a sense, he had some lucky things happen to him that made this possible. He went to this school at Harrow where he got to meet these kind of wealthy children of rulers of Sultan of Brunei and things. And then he became close to the prime minister's family. Via his brother was friends with this guy called Rizza, who was the stepson of the prime minister of Malaysia. But because he had that access, that personal access, he had a kind of a weak link in through the children of that prime minister, and then to the mother, and then to the prime minister. So it was kind of like that. But because he had that, he also had this ability, he knew that at the end of the day, it's all about the story you tell. So he knew this more than anyone else. If a bank called him, one of my favorite examples is a bank called him and said, we noticed some suspicious activity. You got this weird money came into your account. Then you paid it to your dad. Then your dad paid it back to you. Why? Like that seems weird. Why did you pay it to your dad and then you paid it back to you? And the truth was, he was doing it as a money laundering technique to make it look like the money he received was from his dad. Because at that time, he was telling everyone that he was inherited a huge fortune from his grandfather, who was not a billionaire at all. And so by showing someone just part of the story, oh, I received this money from my dad. You didn't show them the rest of the story. I actually got it from this other place, and then I gave it to him, and he gave it back to me. So that was the story he was trying to tell somebody was I received it from my dad. The bank said, well, we see the whole story here. What's going on? And then he absolutely, without breaking a sweat, said to them, how dare you ask something so racist to me about this? And they're like, what? And he said, in my culture, this is what you do. You as the child give your money to your dad, and then they hold it temporarily, and then they give it back to you, and they keep a very small amount as a token. And that's a sign of great respect in my culture. And I'm so outraged that you would question this. And why don't you know this about Chinese Malaysian culture? And they're just like, okay, I understand. Sorry, I'm not racist, you know. And that's
invented on the spot, a fabula.
Yeah, exactly. And then another time, you know, and every single thing that happened in this was a glaring red flag that was just explained very well with a narrative. Sometimes a narrative would be explained as, so for another thing is a small example is, they tried to create this fiction that the money that the prime minister was receiving came from the Saudi royal family. Mm-hmm. It turns out that they were building a lot of fiction on a small truth, because the Ministry of Finance of Saudi did make a donation to the prime minister for whatever purposes. But in reality, that was like a tiny sliver. So in order to make this work, they found these princes who were essentially number 4,099 and 5,000 on the list of 5,000, right? The lowest level princes who didn't even have any money, but they had the right name. So then they had them write letters, sign it. So it's real people, you know? And then, and even things like there was a shell company, in order to make the story work, they would just temporarily transfer the ownership to those guys. And they say, look, I told you it's from an Al Saud member royal family, but it's all just storytelling, you know, it's all fake storytelling. And it worked for a lot of the time, you know?
It's hard to envisage what type of brain you should have to be able to encompass all of these schemes at the same time. And as you said yourself, being also aware of what are the fabulas you've said to which people, so that they don't necessarily intersect. Meanwhile, that's quite fascinating.
But in a sense, he wasn't that good at it, because the whole thing did fall apart. You know, so he was racing through life like somebody that was out of time, and he had a lot of pressure building behind him. So he was messy, he was sloppy, and especially in the beginning. And that's why we know what happened, because we were able to uncover this, you know. And somebody who makes their career on telling lies is a good target for a journalist, because you can go and find out if it's a lie or not a lie, you know.
How exciting. Do you feel that that element of him being disclosed to the point of a proper book, investigation has been written on that account, might have made him a little bit more different in a way that he would behave now? Like, has he matured, do you think?
I think J.Lo started off as like a young guy, not a criminal, and then he became a criminal over time, and now he's a full criminal, you know. So he went from someone who thought they were a good person who did some criminal things to now just become a criminal, you know, because a lot of the stuff he's done ever since this has been even worse, you know, in a sense. Almost more like becoming a traitor to Malaysia, because essentially in the long term, he became a Chinese spy, and he lives in China, and he's protected by China, and he does things on behalf of China that are for China's interests, not for Malaysia's interests. But I think he's probably become an extraordinarily good at all of this stuff. And whereas he started off very bad at money laundering, now he's probably really good at it. And so I think he's really perfected his craft as a result of this. And to be honest, I don't doubt that J.Lo still has another act in his story, because of that skill he has about what people want and what they need. He's perfected that to a degree that I can still see a way for him to get out of trouble, to figure out a way to make the right deal to get out of trouble. And he'll never be able to clean his reputation or escape this story. But, you know, it happens all the time. People kind of reinvent themselves. So I think he strongly believes, and all of his effort to this day is to reinvent himself one more time, at least one more time.
So it sounds like you don't believe that he's ever going to be able to stop on that end.
No, definitely not. But I do think that the investigators can stop. So that's why I think he has a chance, you know?
And that opens up nicely another route here. I'd be very curious to find out from your perspective, given that what he's become, and in my head, he's become someone more of an evolutionary exploit, someone who represents this kind of exception to the rule. But if the rule exists and someone is able to break it, then that raises a lot of question marks, such as how secure are the savings of the everyday taxpayer, do you think? If one individual with enough audacity as him him, and insider knowledge can dismantle trust and do it at scale. What does that say about the safety net so many spent decades building?
Yeah, I think it's full of holes,
Yeah.
I mean, he was moving billions, as you said, around, and this was all stolen money. So, and that wasn't even a particularly ingenious plan. There's probably other frauds happening that are so ingenious and subtle that we don't even know they're happening, and they're bigger than this one, So I think, especially as everything is so digital, and again, we talk about AI, the way that, Joe Low would have loved to use AI. He would have created thousands of pages of documents, all fiction, to make everything he says true. And he would just throw that at someone. A banker would say something, what's going on here? And he would give them a 500-page document, and it was a dream come true for him, these kind of skills. So in this era we live in, where criminals have access to the same tools that are transforming the economy on one side, it's transforming criminality on the other side. So I think it's definitely, we're going to see some pretty crazy frauds and scams in the near term, I'm sure.
Well, to start off with some easy scams, such as common acknowledged scams, such as the cold calling, which is another documentary just released on Netflix, which is just astonishing to know that there are people who just operate on that and do it, absolutely normal, as if it's something that, they should be doing, and it's totally fine to get away with stuff like that when, people are losing everything in the mix. And that would pave the way into our wrap-up questions, if that's all right, because I'm very keen on diving a little bit more on the role of investigative journalism evolving in the age of AI and misinformation, because you have nicely mentioned here that a person like him, a criminal, would love to utilize AI in that dark manner. How and what needs to be done to be able to protect the average reader and the average journalist from that?
I think so everyone has to progress at the same speed, because if criminals are the early adapters and they go all in on AI and everyone else is kind of cautiously moving along, then they will become outsmarted. Yeah. So the best journalist is one that knows everything about AI. They know the power of it. They know how to use it for their own purposes, and they know how an antagonist could use it for their purposes. And then only then would they have the skill set and the ideas for how to validate what's true or not true. And then for the audience, this is probably even more important, is they have to know what is a credible source of information and what is not. Yeah. Because if an audience even trusts what AI tells them, that's a bad sign. You can think it's useful because it's a starting point, or it can be pretty useful or pretty true, but you can't just trust it innately, because right now AI is reading things and then it's consolidating it for you. So it's taking you away from the source of the information. And so the audience has to be very aware of this. And if they see something and they feel wrong about it, they need to be able to go and dig deeper into where that information came from and read the original source materials and come to their own conclusion, So I think it's just a matter of just don't let them go off to the races. Don't be afraid of understanding this tool. Yeah, it could replace a lot of jobs, but it also imperative to you to make sure that you defend your job and your role by using it and understanding its power,
How interesting. And it all plays nicely to the fact that we need to rely on our own skills, not just, fully immerse ourselves into that realm that, the AI would create for you, and actually do a little bit of digging on your own, because that's where the actual source comes from. So from the perspective of you being someone who believes in the terms such as ethical journalism, I believe, right? Because what you write is all about the uncovering the elements of stories that are worth being told in the current framework. What do you think, if stories like Billion Dollar Whale expose not just the flaws in our system, but the kinds of mindsets that can manipulate them, what do you think it takes today to be a builder instead of a breaker? And along that side, more personally, what future skills do you believe matter most now, not just to uncover the truth, but to help rebuild trust?
Well, I think one thing that's important is to believe in the existence of truth. Because a lot of people might say, oh, well, it could be this way, it could be that way. There's a million ways to look at something. But in reality, there is a truth. And there's a truth about things that can be understood through a process. And so it's important to at least believe in that, I think, in order to be useful in journalism. I don't really think of the word ethical journalism myself. I just think of it as more, journalism is about telling the truth. And if you can at least focus on that, then you probably will solve any other questions you might have. It's this very simple thing. Journalism is a nonfiction business. You're telling the truth. And so you want to, and that doesn't mean at the same time that you turn in a 500-page transcript, because storytelling itself is another kind of truth that is not a slave to every little detail, So I think that's kind of how I see that. And then the question about builder versus breaker is, I think it's just about the one unique thing about human life is the ability to envision the future as different than it is now, and to know that the current world we live in is man-made. It's not a natural phenomenon. Like even our economics is not natural. It has a pattern to it, but we designed the rules that made it have, and it has an emergent behavior. So I think it's very important to be a builder is to understand that everything is man-made around us, except for the wind, and that whatever decisions we make can change everything. It can change even how people value work or value each other. It's all about decisions and beliefs and things like that, And I think the more you see that, the more you can feel confident that you can propose things that are different than they are now.
Final question, Bradley, if I may. You've mentioned a quote for me today, the word change. So that inspires me with this question. If there would be one thing that you believe that you can absolutely change and have a strong impact on a bit more of a global scale, what would that be?
Oh wow, that's a difficult one to answer. Well, I think that one thing that I've always had a strong belief in is that the way that we organize ourselves around economic activity, I think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding that has a lot of weird results. And the fundamental misunderstanding is that what is the value of something? What is the value of a thing? And I think we get confused between value and price, and the price of things and the value of things. And I feel like our political economy, or the philosophical framework of our economy, is very much more of like an optimizing machine. So it's optimizing things. It's trying to allocate according to a market. But if we could change something about the economics at the core level, it would probably result in some good things happening across the board.
Well, that will definitely leave some ground for further research, further deep dive. And for those ones who will be listening to this episode afterwards, I'm sure that this will inspire them to actually try to find out more around what you were saying today, because you've left them with a lot of advice, a lot of deep thinking into the career of a journalist, into the element and the mention of the word truth itself and what it means, and the fact that today, living in the area that we are, meaning, it's the abandon of the omnipresence of information, the deep fakes, the automation itself. It's not easy, it's convoluted, but it's how do you make sense of it first? Like this guy, he was trying to make sense of things. He just did it in the wrong way. So thank you so much for your time, Bradley.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Pleasure.